All right, so let's now talk about the process and framework. Okay, so let's, granted this is an hour, we could build this framework a lot more, so I wanted to give you at least a structure so you can walk out of this room being able to apply it. So at your desks, you each have a bit of a handout. Right, this one right here. Okay, so let's go through it, and if everyone could grab a pen, we're going to do a couple of exercises now. So when it comes to succession planning, I would say that there are 6 important steps that we need to look at. And I'm going to go through each one in depth. Okay? So the first one is identifying those critical roles. In order for us to build succession plans, we need to know, well, what are those key positions that we need to look at? So identifying critical roles. The next one is, once we know what those roles are, what does success look like in those roles? And I don't mean just success today, I mean success in the future too, for those particular roles. The third one is nominate successors. So now we know what the role entails today and in the future, but who are these people going to be? Who we peg for these positions, right? What can they do, could they do, want to do? This is where we start nominating these successors. Once we have nominated them, we start to look at, okay, so what are the skills that they bring to the table today? And what don't they have, so we can start closing those gaps. So this is where the skills kind of assessment takes place. Then we develop them. We say, okay, so here's the gap, and here's the action plan, and this is what we need to do to get you to that position so we can transition you successfully. And here's the one that companies often miss, and I would say they miss it on almost every HR initiative, whether it's change management, anything. It's actually measuring whether or not it worked. So measuring progress is going to be important. Did this person transition effectively into this role? Was it the right fit? And maybe over time, like when I was transitioning into the role over 3 years, maybe, let's just say maybe year 2, maybe it was no longer the right fit. Maybe I would have been a better fit in this other position. So that's what I mean by it's a dynamic process. And so here are the 6 different steps, and we're going to go through it one by one. Identifying critical roles. What I wanted to do today is I wanted to give you this handout because really what it has is it has really important questions that you can ask yourselves in each of these different steps. And this will really start the process of identifying who these successors are. So identifying critical roles, what are the key positions in your organization? So here are some questions to ask. Which roles have the greatest impact on our performance in our organization? Which roles require specialized or unique expertise? And this one is super important. The more niche kind of skill set it is, the more difficult it's going to be to replace that position, right? And so start looking at that skill set that people have within these roles. And if it's very specialized, we know it's going to be tough to get someone else in their shoes. Which roles are geographically unique, one of a kind? And so I worked in telecoms for many years, and we had field service technicians dispersed in many different areas in BC, Alberta, Ontario, and some of them were very remote areas as well. And I can tell you when people left, it was very hard to fill those positions. And so start looking at geography as well. Do you have people working in remote locations where it may be hard to fill those positions? Which roles have a projected market shortage? So start looking at that too. Like start looking at our industry and what the future holds. Like will we have a shortage in a certain role? Are millennials maybe not interested in some of those roles? So then there'll be a shortage there too. So we need to start looking at that because if we have a shortage, what we're talking about is we have multiple employers vying for the same talent. It's going to be incredibly competitive to get that talent in our doors. And which roles are the most difficult to replace? Right? So that kind of sums it all up. So here are all of the questions that I would like you to consider, and I'd like you to take about a minute, grab that pen, and I want you to write down up to three roles that you can think of right now in your organization that would fit into this critical role. Which roles are critical roles in your organization based on these questions? I'd like you to jot those roles down for me. So what are those titles? So anyone willing to share, can everyone talk to me about some of the roles that you wrote down? I just want to hear the spectrum, what we have out here. Yes, sir.
The C-level.
Okay, C-level positions. Payroll. Yes. Say that again, I'm sorry. Parts and services manager. Yes. Engineering. IT. I love it. We've got the different departments in that going. So do you see like the spectrum of roles here as well? C-level roles, but we have some potentially other mid roles, maybe even entry-level roles here within the organization. So that's really important. We need to start looking across the board with what those critical roles are. So now what I'd like you to do is circle just one of the roles that you have written down, because that'll be our focus for the other 5 steps that we go through. So choose whichever one you'd like to work on for the next 5 steps. Okay. So now we know what the role is. The next step is, well, how do we build a success profile? So how do we know what knowledge, skills, abilities, competencies are needed for this role today and in the future? Here are the questions you ask. So what competencies are required for the role right now? Right? So oftentimes or sometimes we'll have job descriptions that'll kind of have that mapped out already, what competencies are needed. And when I say competencies, what I'd like us to do is start looking at not just technical competencies, but also start looking at the soft skills too. Right? I hate calling them soft skills because I think they're the hardest skills to learn, but soft skills. Okay, so technical and soft skills. Start looking at that. And then ask yourself, well, are the competencies actually aligned to our strategy, to our vision, to our mission, to our values? Because as I said at the beginning of the presentation, our roles don't stay stagnant, and they shouldn't. They do evolve over time. As our companies change, roles change too. So let's start asking ourselves, well, do these competencies do we even still require them for this role moving forward? And then what are the anticipated future skill requirements for this role? So I can tell you, in telecoms, I joined a company. I was hired as an HR manager. And my role very quickly changed. We started implementing an HRIS system. I had never worked in an HRIS system, so that was added. There are always things that are added to your plate, right? And so oftentimes this is why we say job descriptions should be looked at probably annually, if possible, just to upkeep them.
Sofia?
Yes. Yes.
I think
Yes, sir.
what I want to share here is
Yes.
one of the things we're struggling with in our company is to identify where the business will be in the future.
Right.
Here I'm looking at perhaps a 10-year time frame.
Right.
For us, that is a struggle because it will determine how we do some of these things.
Right. Right.
And we cannot assume that everything remains the same. And that's how the difficulty is identifying what kind of, how we're going to do the business in the first place.
Right.
How's the marketplace going to be? And how we're going to get the people to support that business of the future. That's where we're at.
Thank you for mentioning that. So it is not easy when we start to look at, well, what does the future hold for our company and what should it look like? I mean, that all is sort of the strategic planning side, and it's difficult for all of us to know what the future entails. And maybe we even anticipate that it'll look a certain way and then it doesn't as well. So we need to know that things will evolve and change over time. We'll have curveballs that come our way. My suggestion is, try to research industry as much as you can to see sort of what those market shortages are at least. I typically go online and start looking at not just competitors, but also across industries. What do those roles look like in those companies too? Maybe we can borrow and leverage some of that as well. Maybe we haven't captured everything that we could for specific roles. So there are different ways we could do that if we don't know specifically what that vision looks like for our company 10 years down the road, right? So this is important for us to look at. Oftentimes companies will look at, okay, well, Sofia, here's the job description and here's what our people do in this role right now. I'm like, that's fantastic, that's great. Let's talk about the future too. So what could the role look like? And so what I'd like you to do now with that one role that you've circled on your piece of paper, could you write down 2 competencies for me that you think would be important both now and into the future for that role? 2 competencies that you can think of. So here I'm thinking of innovative thinking, could be a competency, right? So think of a competency, technical or soft skills, that would be important for this role. I think I'm going to ask you to share a little bit. All right, we ready to share? Okay. Some brave souls out there. Share. Share with me. Yes.
We're looking for digitization, so someone that's digitally and automated knowledge. So
Okay.
especially in 10 years from now, our industry's going to change.
Better be tech savvy. Yeah.
And then I also put for soft skills, I put emotional intelligence and awareness.
Okay. So emotional intelligence and awareness. Tech savvy, right? What was the other one as well? So there's the technical and soft skills competencies right there captured. Any other ones? Thank you for that. Yes.
Robotics.
What was that?
Robotics.
Robotics. Excellent.
Effective communication.
Effective communication. Anyone else? Okay. So do we see from those competencies alone that we've captured technical and soft skills, right? So that's what I'd like you to do. That's what I'd like you to do as we move forward is typically those competencies need to capture both, because as we evolve over time, you can be technically sound in a role, but there's also going to be a lot of elements where we need to have those soft skills embedded in what we do as well. Okay. Number 3. So now we know what the success profile looks like today and into the future. Now it's, okay, so who do we have? Who do we have under this roof or in our company to be able to take over these positions? And so this is where you start nominating successors. So identifying those people who could move into these critical roles. I'll go through the questions and then I'll mention something. So here are the questions that you could ask yourself. Does the individual have the knowledge, skills, ability, and desires, that want factor, to be able to take over this position and fulfill the role? When will they be ready to take over this role? So if they had offered me that HR manager position, and let's say they quickly found out, oh, Sofia needs maybe 6 years to get into that role instead of the 3 years, I'm probably not going to be a successor for that role because the transition wouldn't have happened. They needed someone faster in that role. So think about the timelines as well as to readiness for that position. Does this fit into our timeline? And are an appropriate number of candidates being identified? Now, some of you may have small businesses where you're not going to have multiple successors nominated for positions, and that's fine. Some of you may be larger organizations where you may have a few. That's almost as backup. But let me tell you that the moment you go up to somebody and you say, you're going to be considered a successor for a role, in their heads, they're going, awesome, I've got the role. Right? So there's a lot of damage control that may have to take place the moment you have a conversation like that. So oftentimes the way I would approach it with clients is saying, you know what, let's start building a culture of skill development and growth and learning opportunities. And so that's how we approach it with goal setting. What would you like to see? What's your talent profile? What would you like to see in the future? Let's start building action plans and goal setting in our annual reviews, etc. That then becomes sort of a prelude to who those successors are and having those conversations once you've nailed them down. So just remember, the moment you have that conversation is when they believe that you've promised them the position. So those conversations are important. So this is what you would ask yourself in terms of nominating who those successors are. And here I would look at diversity too. As you're looking at successors for positions, do you have a diverse group that have been nominated as these key positions moving forward? Okay. Next one is you have nominated these people now for this position. Next is, well, what are their skills? What are their skills? So this is where you're going to conduct that assessment to see what where their talent lies and what the gaps are. So questions. How long will it take to get the potential successor in place? What specific training is needed as well? Okay.
Sophia,
Yes.
can you recommend any type of skills assessment tools available to assess skills?
The way I've often done it is typically because there are competencies and competency grids typically in the companies I've worked at with telecoms and public practice accounting. It would be measured across that. So it would be essentially looking at each of the competency buckets or functions or expectations in each role and seeing, well, where do they lie? Have they met all of that? Have they exceeded? Have they not met it? I can look that up for you. That's a great question. Great question.
Sophie, do you ever use
Yes.
Colby?
No. Talk to me about it.
It's conative, so it's your natural instincts, striving instincts.
Mm-hmm.
So it's there's only one test. It's Colby.
Okay.
C-O-B-E. So organizations will do a B, which is the job. So they'll see if their striving instincts match. It doesn't matter whether they have the skill set,
Right.
because they'll learn it if they fit what the other excellent people have done.
Right. Colby.
Colby.
Okay, I'm going to look that up. That's great. Perfect. Thank you. Anyone else? How do you assess skills in your organizations?
We use
Yes.
something called predictive index.
Predictive index.
Yeah, have you heard of that one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We use that a lot.
Okay. And do you use that across the board for different positions?
We use it for different departments. So if we have a department that's experiencing high turnover, we definitely do a pro, so we analyze the actual job, and then the people that are in the role, see how they match and how they fit.
Okay.
We see the ones that have left the company generally not always fit the role. So, yeah.
Predictive index. Great. Anyone else?
Yeah,
I love that, Mel.
I've used predictive index as well in the previous role.
Yeah.
Currently we're using Harrison assessments. And Harrison assessments based on the enjoyment theory. So it assesses whether, it doesn't assess whether the person can actually do the job, but whether they enjoy doing the job.
Okay.
So
That desire part that we talked about before.
the happier you are,
Yeah.
the success is going to be.
Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write those 3 down, and then I'll send it out in an email to everybody so you have that listing. Does that work? Okay. Beautiful. So we're going to start assessing people's skill set at this point, and this is really to determine, well, what are the gaps and how do we fill them? So the 5th step then is developing talent. So at this point we know, okay, so for my example that I gave you this morning, I had experience in HR, but I didn't necessarily have the credentials, right? I didn't have my CPHR designation. I didn't have my HR degree. So that was the gap for me, is I really needed to have that in order to move into that managerial role. And so developing talent is setting the appropriate goals and making sure that they have time to prepare for that succession. So it's hopefully a seamless transition. It's not too ugly to move into that role. So what are the specific areas of opportunity? Where do they need to grow and learn? What are the resources available to hone in on these areas? So this one for me, it's not strictly programs. It's not strictly, workshops and professional development. It could be internally job shadowing with one person or multiple people across the organization. You can get really creative with how you fill this skill gap for people. And I can tell you that when I worked in telecoms, it was one of the most beautiful things where I was able to go on a ride along with a field service technician and really understand what they did. It was amazing for me to sit with a call center and go, oh, so this is what the calls sound like, and this is what people ask. That's great. So I was able to understand then the business because I had those opportunities to sit with different people. So if you have that opportunity, that would be amazing to be able to do that, and that's where people can start honing in on those skills. And the question you need to ask yourself was, well, okay, so we've determined the successor, and we know what the skill gaps are. Well, do we have a development plan in place? Or is it just all like verbal? So let's have a development plan in place, because that's what's going to help us with the 6th piece, which is, are we measuring it then? Are we looking at it? Typically when I do a development plan, I think we all know like SMART goals, right? So is it time bound? Do we have deadlines there? Are there specific steps, people maybe that they need to meet? What are the objectives? So really start to build a comprehensive action plan for these people so that they can transition into these roles successfully. Any questions on this one? We'll have an open Q&A as well. Okay. And the 6th one is tracking progress and measuring it. So let's say they moved me into that role, they wanted me to be in HR, they built me an action plan, and if I later tell them, oh yeah, I'm not interested in doing the CPHR designation, I don't know, I'm probably going to hold that off for a little bit. Or, oh, job shadowing, no, I'm good with the EA role. Like they have to measure it to make sure that I'm still ready. The readiness is there and the desire is still there to move into that position. That's why it's dynamic. And that's why sometimes companies, if they have the ability to, they have a backup as well. So, tracking progress. Are you diligently meeting with this potential successor? And we could do a full-on presentation on performance meetings and performance management and those kinds of things, right? The annual review and meeting them one time a year isn't going to be enough. Same here. It's not going to be enough meeting them once and saying, you're the successor, here's your action plan, go ahead. And in 3 years, you're going to move into that role. We need to have those touch points. And are the successful candidates performing well in their new role? So when I started transitioning into that HR managerial role, really it was important for them to kind of check in and go, Sofia, what else do you need in order to set you up for success? I mean, that HR manager is now gone, so what else do you need? Okay, so that's really important as well to continue to build that momentum. So those are the 6 steps with questions that you can ask yourselves. Hopefully you can wrap your heads around kind of who those successors are, what they need moving forward as well. So some key questions that you can ask. I'm going to send you something that looks like this tomorrow, but a little bit fancier. And it's an Excel spreadsheet, and it has a couple of drop downs and things like that. So I'll send this to you either today or tomorrow. But basically, it's a succession chart that you can start using. And typically, this kept me on track to kind of know when the dates were that we met with people within the organization and just what their track record was, right? So here we have Jane Smith. She's currently a CEO. She's been in her position for 2 years and a month. And then here's where you'd list all the past successes. So that's going to be what can she do today? Well, she reduced company expenses by 10%. Jane is awesome. That's great. What's the future role? We'd like her to be our president. She'll need such and such training moving forward to develop her skill set, because that's the gap. We're going to move her in by October 24th, 2022. And it's going to take her about 2 years. Time for readiness. Keeps it on track. So I think the one I send you is going to be a little bit color-coded too. Like if it's not started, it'll be red. It'll have fancy, red, yellow, green kind of stuff. So I'll send that out to you in just a moment. So feel free to use that. And you can make it as fancy and in-depth as you like. You can put a full-on action plan in here as well. So we've gone through what succession planning is. We've gone through why it's important. We've gone through how do we actually do it. And I wanted to give you a couple of resources as well that you can look up. Show of hands, how many of you have seen something like this, the 9-box grid? Okay, so a few. So there are many variations on this 9-box grid. Take a look. You can just Google 9-box grid for succession planning, and there'll be tons that come up. But basically for this, when you start nominating successors, so in that step of step number 3, nominating successors, to try to take out as much subjectivity as possible, this is a grid that some companies use to say, okay, well, is this person a superstar, and should we kind of expedite and get this person in a role really, really quickly? Because we don't want to lose that talent. And so typically on the y-axis here, we have potential, and on the x-axis is performance. So if someone has high performance, high potential, I call them a rock star, but they could be a consistent star too, right? So looking at these 3 are going to be important because these are people that you don't want to lose in your organizations. This is top talent that we're talking about. Okay, so you could use a 9-box grid. This to me is still not in depth to remove some of that subjectivity. I believe that you need some characteristics, some KPIs in there in each of these boxes, because when one person asks, well, why is so-and-so a successor and I'm not a successor? Like, I think I have the same skill set. Then you actually have some measures to be able to go back and say, this is what's missing, or this is what the gap is. And so let me show you something that I saw at one of my HR events that I went to. I recognize that for the people at the back, it's going to be hard to see, but here's the objective. They've taken the 9-box grid and they've moved it into a 4-box grid, so you can play around with it however you like. And what they've done is they've put in each grid the characteristics that are involved and what the expectations are. Right? I mean, this is sort of bare bones. Like, they had a much bigger version of this, but this is important because what it does is you can actually have that really in-depth conversation with someone saying, here are all the characteristics that you possess. Therefore, we're going to expedite, or you're going to be moving into a position within the next 3 to 5 years. So this breaks it down really nicely. So this is going to involve playing around with the 9-box grid and making it your own within your firms and organizations, yeah? This is where the support is definitely needed. It's low potential, low performance. So we're going to have to work on this group right here. But this one right here is green for a reason. We need to build them into our succession plans to retain that talent. So to close off, I'm going to give you a couple of best practices, and then we'll open it up. Buy-in. I would say any type of initiative, it doesn't matter what the initiative is, we have to have buy-in at the top. If we don't, it's going to fall flat, right? So take that why section, some of those stats, start looking at your industry, start seeing why we need to have succession planning, and start to add that on our priority list within our organization. We need to have buy-in at the top. The next one is, even if we don't do succession planning, let's start in our organizations offering opportunities and rewarding people and recognizing when we start knowledge sharing. Give people these opportunities where they can share their knowledge and transfer some of their knowledge. That office manager that left after 18 years, how amazing would that have been if other people within that firm knew what she did and had that opportunity to learn from her? She was masterful at client service. What an amazing opportunity for other people in that firm to learn from her, to learn from the best, right? So promote knowledge transfer and sharing as much as possible. Here's a biggie. That HR manager that retired with the firm I was at, and I would say any retiree, the worst thing we could do is make them feel like they're being pushed out the door. So involve them in the process as much as possible. Have them help us with identifying who those successors are. Let them help with the action plan of what this person needs and how they can build success into what this person's going to do. Include them in the process. It's going to be really important because you want that knowledge transfer as well, right, to take place. I often get asked, well, whose responsibility is succession planning? It's yours, right? It's HR. And my answer to that is no. I think HR is more of advisory and to support with the process. I would say it's your line managers. I think our managers need to have some accountability when it comes to succession planning. They're seeing the work of our employees day after day. They know what that talent is, and I think that they should be held accountable for wanting to leave the organization better than maybe when they joined, right? So building that potentially into our KPIs and how we measure our manager performance, I think is going to be very important. We talked about this. Review demographics, so we're proactive, fire prevention, and just make sure that these conversations are taking place, right? The moment these conversations take place is when people start recognizing that our culture involves developing our people. It means that we're invested in our people. It means our people are not just sort of people that we can brush aside at the end. We care about them. So those feelings that I talked to you about at the beginning of the presentation after that meeting with that partner, where I felt really appreciated and respected and valued and invested in, that's what we want. And that's how people feel when you have those conversations with them. So please don't do this anymore when you go back. Please don't do this. Let's start wrapping our heads around succession planning. And it doesn't matter what format it takes. It could be incredibly formal. It doesn't have to be. But look at how you can start embedding this into your organizations. And I'm going to leave you with this quote. So money is just a commodity. Talent supplies the edge. And I believe that the moment you start looking at the talent within your organizations and the people side is when you're going to have that competitive advantage. So that was a lot of talking. So thank you so much for being a receptive audience and asking your questions as well. And my hope is that you have learned something today where you can start applying it just like I did that day and I started revamping our social media policy. I hope you go back and do the same with your succession planning and looking at how you assess your talent within in-house. Okay? So thank you for being here.